and welcome to this instalment of the Society for the Environment Policy Leaders interview series. Today it's a pleasure to introduce Lesley Sloss. Hi, Lesley.
Hi.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. Excited for this.
Wonderful. So starting with you then, could you please give us an introduction into your role and specifically how this links to policy influence?
Absolutely. I have been working with what's now called the International Centre for Sustainable Carbon for almost 34 years. It used to be called the International Energy Agency Clean Coal Centre, the IEA, and so it's under the auspices of the IEA in Paris. So the IEA have information think tanks on oil, gas, renewables, nuclear, and so on. We were the think tank on coal. But now we're expanded so that we can cover biomass co-firing as well. So because we work for the IEA, we're not for profit. We are funded by member countries to produce information that's relevant to growing economies that may not be able to afford such information. And the information we produce has to be completely unbiased. It has to be completely based on fact. Everything's peer reviewed. And so it's an honour to be working for a group where it is focused entirely on fact and honesty and truth, even if it's the facts and honesty and truth that you don't want to hear in the energy sector. So I'm proud to be part of that, and I've grown into that over the last couple of years. I love it.
Wonderful. That sounds so interesting from a more international point of view as well. And also, especially when you're working with an organisation based on integrity, I think it makes you feel so much more valued in what you're doing. And I think it's also quite motivating because you really do believe in the cause and what you're working for.
Absolutely.
So what sparked your interest in the environmental field in general? What led you to pursue an environmental career?
I didn't start out. I mean, obviously, like any other kid in the 1970s, if you did well at sciences, you were geared towards medicine. And I didn't get into medicine. And then I thought I might do forensic science, but my dad was doing that, so I couldn't do that. And I kind of found my way into biochemistry and then a PhD in microbiology. I published 17 papers, and that I was taken on because I was a scientific writer rather than anything else. And so I started on writing reports about, what happens to trace elements through a coal-fired power plant. How do we blend coals to reduce emissions? It was all very much, here's a question, look up all the information you have. I mean, you're talking about borrowing in papers from the National Library back in those days, phoning people around the world, going to conferences, trying to gather information over the space of maybe 8 months to produce a document 80 pages long that summarised the situation, went out for peer review. And so through that process, I mean, although I wasn't an engineer and I'm not a combustion scientist, doing that for 34 years, you kind of osmose the information into your brain. So I became an environmental specialist, not by want, but by design.
Wow, yeah, I think a lot of environmental consultants or people working in the environmental sector do definitely have that scientific background. In our previous interview for this series, I discussed whether or not we need more specialists or scientific experts in policy making. Do you think this is something that we need for environmental policy to progress?
Absolutely. I mean, I work with the Minamata Convention. There are Kyoto protocols and Montreal protocols which deal with SOx, NOx, carbon, and so on. The Minamata Convention is about mercury, the stuff in thermometers, but it can build in the environment. It can cause neurological disorders in babies, and it builds up in the food chain. So you have to control it from all sources, including from the energy sector. And so my role is to go in and feed information into that situation and make sure I'm giving only facts, because policymakers are normally not scientists. And they're coming in to sign a convention, write a convention on something as widely various, that's not the word, but broad as mercury. Mercury's involved in gold mining, it's involved in dental amalgam, it's involved in vaccines, it's involved in air, in fish, in the environment. And so you can't have a policymaker that understands that fully and can start setting emission limits and changes in industry, because they just don't have that knowledge. They're there to negotiate on behalf of the scientists. And so we are that kind of interface between, I don't want to say the geeks, but the real intellectual scientists who know what they're doing and the policymakers, and we're there to simplify it. So that, you know, they ask me a difficult question: can we set the emission limit for mercury? Will it work? I then go back to the scientists and say, you know, is this achievable? If so, how much is it going to cost? Will it work in China as well as it works in the USA? Try and simplify that so that when we feed back into the convention discussions, we get to a convention setting with comments that are achievable, as well as aiming to get to the goals that you want. Everybody wants emissions to come down, but if you set a convention that's too challenging, it's a waste of time. Nobody's going to do it. People are going to walk away.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think there's a really interesting debate in politics about the balance between a technocratic government and then a government that's also democratic and considering the wants and needs of the people. So I think especially in environmental policy, and I think this is a lesson that we definitely learned from the pandemic and definitely came across in the messaging from the government, is that we have to prioritize the science. So totally.
Yeah. And the scientists are not always going to agree. I mean, you are going to have mismatches. And at that point, you know, somebody just has to be sensible and say a little bit of give and take here, and let's just do our best and reassess as we go along to make sure that if we're making mistakes, we can U-turn. Scientists, like a lot of other organisations, we're happy to be corrected. You know, if a fact changes, if numbers change, we'll turn in a dime and we'll adjust and we'll change accordingly. I think a lot of politicians in other industries don't like to admit that they've made a mistake and will try and carry on with a policy. And I think they need to listen to the science. It's when the scientist said, whoops, we got that wrong, you're going to have to rethink.
So what would you say a normal week in your role looks like? What do you typically do on a day-to-day basis?
I wrote down what I thought I was doing this week, which was editing a new report on best practice for emission reduction in India. I'm preparing for a workshop we're running in Jakarta, along with the Indonesian ministry, to try and tighten their emission limits and set their compliance strategy on the Minamata Convention. But I have spent my week looking at intellectual property laws, because some of the materials we have produced are being copied by somebody else. Trying to do accounts. I hate accounts. When it comes to project management, you're given a project that you love to do, but there's always that little bit that you don't enjoy. That's the accounts. But the project management is great. You can be answering phone calls, you can be talking to ministers, you can be trying to crunch numbers in the back of an envelope. It's a wonderfully exciting and variable job.
It does sound really interesting. I mean, working with India, working in the ministry in Indonesia, that sounds really, really interesting. And completely with project management, it always sounds like you kind of have to dip your toes into things that you might not have always planned to do, but it just sounds like a really interesting role to be involved with. So what do you think you enjoy most about your role?
I think it's the people and the challenges. I mean, everybody thinks in this role, when you're talking about emission strategies and reduction, that it's the number crunching side of things and the technology. If you set an emission limit of 30 micrograms for mercury, how do you get coal plants to get down to that? And it's not that at all. It's more about that emission limit will work in the Western countries where they can afford to comply with emission reductions. When you go to India and Indonesia and these emerging regions, it's far more about affordability. It's about priorities. In our world, Western world, and let's admit it, we created the climate issue through our industrial revolution. We've caused this chaos. And now we're rich, sitting back and looking at these other countries and saying, would you mind cleaning up your act? And they haven't even finished their industrial revolution yet. So we're looking to India to say, could you stop burning coal and stop being industrialized? And they haven't got power to their entire population. They don't have reliable power. So you're talking about saying to them, could you just not bother with schools and hospitals and all the things that we're entitled to as everyday requirements for human growth. Could you put that aside and stop burning the coal or burning the gas that you need to get yourselves there? And that's not fair. But at the same time, we do want them to move to a cleaner way of doing it. So we have to take on board the cost of that, their priorities. There's the energy trilemma. Sorry, I'm going to go down the sideline here. The energy trilemma, which is the balance of the cost of power, the security of that power, and the environmental consequences of that power. Now, we're in the Western world, we can afford it, so we can start messing around with renewables, which is brilliant, but they're not reliable yet. And as we've seen through COVID and through the Ukraine situation, when the gas becomes not secure anymore, we will start charging more money, so the cost goes out the window. And at the same time, countries such as Germany in November dug up a wind farm to get to the coal mine underneath. The UK, which had said it's closed its last coal plant 2 years ago, switched them back on again to get us through that energy security crisis. So what we're saying is, when push comes to shove, do you know what? We're throwing cost and the environment out the window. We're keeping the lights on. So we have to accept that these emerging economies are going to prioritise keeping the lights on. And if we want them to take into account the environment, we have to help them as much as we possibly can. And the roadblock I'm facing at the moment right now is that there's JET2, the Just Energy Transition. There's a lot of funding coming down under Kyoto Protocols and the Paris Convention, but none of it is allowed to be spent on coal-fired power plants. There's the argument that you can't spend money on or you'll extend the life of the plant and that will continue the problem. But that kind of is blinkered in that you don't see that these countries are going to keep burning that coal anyway. Even if they build renewables as fast as they possibly can, they can't turn off that coal for the next 20 years. So why not accept that reality and give us some money to clean up those coal plants until they close down? And that's what we're facing is the countries outside pointing and saying, turn off those coal plants, and me standing in front of these emerging economies saying, they want to, but they can't. Please help and fix this challenge. And that's where people come into it. You need people that listen to that and are prepared to work with you. Because if you stand in front of the coal sector and look as if you're defending it, then all of a sudden I'm the bad guy. Whereas, hopefully I'm not the bad guy. I'm just speaking on behalf of growing economies.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because development is I think it's one of the greatest challenges facing climate change and environmental issues in general, because it's so tricky. My family's from Colombia, and I was always speaking about this with my family, that development from their perspective just has to and will look completely different than it will here, because the essence of the country is completely different. They're at a completely different stage in their development, in their economies, even in the norms and values. I mean, if we look at corporate cultures now, I know they're often guilty of greenwashing and things like that, but they do have a general narrative of green issues and things. When you're in a developing country, it's not going to be prioritized or featured in the same way because they are at a different stage. So no, that's so interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. So your work spans so many different countries, as you've just shed some light on. What has this international experience taught you, and about how policy is made and how it can be influenced?
Every country is completely different, and you get a project that will work successfully in, say, for example, Indonesia. You try and copy that to India, and it's just a different reality. So it's continual change, it's continual learning, and understanding the priorities of the country you're working with. As always, you're given money to go into these regions to capacity build, and you have to be very aware that to them it looks like you're coming in and saying, I know what to do, I'm going to fix this for you, get out of my way and do as you're told. And you can't do that. You have to work with them. And in fact, when you go over there, they know the problems. I was just back from, I think I've spent 9 weeks in India over the last 6 months. And they have set emission limits that are really challenging. I mean, they are aiming to get the power plants and the utility sector under control. And people are outside saying, well, this legislation's been there since 2015. Why are the emissions not coming down? And when you go out to see them and say, what's going on here, guys? They say, okay, we're burning the lowest quality coal in the world. It's 50% ash. Half of it doesn't burn. We have very limited water. So the technologies that you use in Europe, flue gas desulfurization, it's not going to work in India. We don't have the water to do it. And at the same time, India is accelerating to comply with the emission limits within as fast as they can. The same emission limits that that Europe and North America took 30 years to comply with. So they took their time and went through the plants and put the control technologies, improved the technologies, got everything working. We're asking India to kind of flip on a coin, start installing those systems now and make them work. And they're not going to work the same way as they do in the Indian plants. Plus, 400 gigawatts, you've got thousands of coal plants all trying to put control technologies on at the same time. There's not enough people. There's not enough metal. You can't take all those power plants off to fix them for 6 months and then put them back online. The logistics and the reality of what should happen are very different to what is achievable. And that's where you have to go in and say, okay, we see your problem. How can we help? What can we do to work with you? Should we bring in more experts? Should we set up a channel of experts coming in on these technologies and work with you? Just think on your feet, I think, is the answer there.
Thank you. I like how you brought up the issue of the differences between emerging economies and the rest, and also providing a solution, because I think sometimes it can be quite easy to get tangled in the challenges of development and environmental policy, but we have to focus on the solutions and how we can actually help. But it's really interesting to hear about those specific examples, because I certainly have heard fairly little about what we're actually doing on a daily basis or how organisations are trying to influence that environmental policy in those regions. So it's very interesting. And could you give an example of how you have effectively worked in collaboration to influence policy?
Yes, I guess I actually helped set the emission limit for mercury in Indonesia. Back in the late 2016, 2017, we were working on a UN program. We went out, we worked with the Indonesian utilities to measure mercury from their plants. They have over 100 units. We looked at every single one of them. We looked at what the configuration was, what the coal they burned. And we have created a ranking. So we know what each plant's going to emit over the remaining lifetime. Helps you prioritise the plants. We decided on emission limit, which they've adopted. We recommended monitoring continuously on the plants, just to make sure the numbers are right. That is going in. And now this meeting I'm running in 2 weeks' time in Jakarta with the ministries is saying, okay, you've got the emission limit, you've got the monitors in there. The next step is to, once you've identified the plants that are emitting higher mercury than you would like, what are your strategies for bringing those down? And we bring the technology providers in to say, okay, we can use some oxygen, we can use some activated carbon, you can install this. And so it's going straight from evaluating the extent of the problem to putting in some legislation to make sure you've got that right, and then saying, okay, that's your target now, we're going to help you get to that target. And to see that whole journey through is so satisfying. I cannot tell you how satisfying that is.
Thank you. Yes, it sounds really interesting. I didn't know you'd actually worked in Indonesia.
Yep. Yeah. The ministries there are actually really forward thinking, and they are all their coal plants that they're putting in now are the advanced state of the art plants. But until they can move over to renewable, they do have to keep this existing fleet going for the economy and the growth of the country. But they are trying very hard to go back to these older plants. They're considering advanced techniques such as the biomass co-firing to offset the coal, but also ammonia co-firing they're considering. They're really forward-thinking in Indonesia. I'm really proud of the different ways they're considering accelerating the move away from coal.
That's great. Different thinking is always valuable. That's great. So your expertise has led you to act as an advisor to the UN groups on clean energy and sustainability, among other international institutions. What does this role involve? Could you give us an idea?
Meetings, an awful lot of meetings. because, I'm in that lovely little zone between, the real people that have the genuine knowledge and the policymakers. There's a lot of, questions coming down saying, if we did this, what would happen? Me taking that to the partnership area within UNEP that I lead and saying, okay, what can we do? What are the options here? Build that back and then take it back up. So there's an awful lot of back and forthing and a lot of explaining to people, well, in theory that's good, it's not going to work in practice. A lot of honest conversations, a lot of networking. I think my husband calls it a butterfly collector. When you meet someone, I'm sure you've done this, you meet someone through the line of work, you think, you would be so useful if you could speak to this person here. So it's creating a lot of spider webs and joining people with the right people to get an honest answer, knowing that they will trust that person. Sometimes they won't trust me. I'm still seen as speaking on behalf of the coal industry. I don't, but I understand that some people will think I'm biased. So in that situation, I will try to find somebody else that agrees with what I'm saying and can represent the truth on my behalf.
Yeah, that's really interesting to understand how the networks work together, and also that you sometimes have to be a bit strategic in the best way. Interesting.
Somebody said it's not what you know, it's who you know knows. Sometimes you don't know, but you know somebody who will know. And that's the power of the network, is knowing who to phone.
That's great. And that's something that we really push for at CEnv, is that environmental collaboration. We want collaboration across all the sectors between all environmental professionals. So that's great to hear from our perspective as well. And we've touched on lots of challenges today, but if you had to say, let's say, the top 3 biggest challenges of your policy work, what do you think they would be?
I think remaining neutral can be really challenging, because sometimes I do have an opinion. I mean, I'm there not to defend the coal sector, but to put the facts out for the coal sector. And in some situations you think, you could try a little bit harder to replace this with solar and wind. There are ways that countries could accelerate faster than they're doing. But again, it comes down to the finances there. Challenges with respect to finding the right person, making sure that the information I'm giving is correct. Sometimes I worry that, I have cherry-picked the data, and I worry that someone will come back and say, no, you misrepresented that. Especially in a public forum like this, I'm being recorded, and somebody could come back and say, Indonesia didn't say emission. That is worrying. But otherwise, no, the biggest challenge is possibly the flights and the logistics of travelling back and forth to these countries, hotel bookings, because I'm taking teams of people. Sometimes I feel more like a travel agent than a policy.
Thank you. Yeah, it must be really difficult to be actually neutral and also be perceived as neutral. I think those are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. It's very interesting. And I didn't realize you had to travel so much for your role. Do you enjoy it now, or it's...
I love it. But I mean, sometimes it's so much. Like, for example, in November, I just decided to stay out there for the whole month, because back and forth is not good for the environment. I'm off to Indonesia on Friday for 2 weeks. I'm back for 5 days, and then I'm off to Chennai and Nagpur in India. And that's bad for the environment. I put my hand up, I fly more than I should. But in these situations, when you're talking about policy development, you can't do that in an email. You have to go out, you have to see the plans, you have to talk to the ministers and understand what's their priority, not what you think is their priority. So you have to have face-to-face meetings.
Absolutely, and it's a balance. As long as the positive impact outweighs the negatives of the environmental or the carbon impact.
I hope so, yeah.
It's definitely worth it. So our final question for today then, do you have any advice for anyone that is interested in getting more involved in environmental policy or looking to enter that sector?
Yes, I would say in a lot of industries, it's the tall poppies. You want to stand up and you want to be heard and you want to be that name in the industry that people think, I heard Lesley speak at this meeting, whatever. I would say for the first couple of years, don't speak. If you're moving into a policy arena, listen first. Be very wary of stepping up and having an opinion early on in a situation that could be wrong. Get your facts straight. You can always phone someone after the meeting and say, I'm so sorry, I should have said this. But you can't unsay something. and you can't unmisrepresent facts. So I think because policy is so important, it's such a delicate situation of personalities, never mind facts, that just tread carefully and wisely, slowly if necessary, but on a nice steady path towards the unified goal.
Absolutely. I think something that before kind of learning a bit more about policy, I didn't realise how important the relationship side of it is. I thought it would be more kind of technical, as you've discussed. I didn't realise that the network, like we talked about today, is so crucial to success in that sense.
Also, a sense of be humble. As a Western economy, when you're working with emerging regions, you go in with your Western hat on thinking they're the bad guys, they're the polluters, and they're not. We've been the bad guys for so long that it's so unfair of us to ride over there on our white horse and say, you're doing it wrong, let us fix it for you. You have to be humble and say, we made a lot of mistakes. Let us help you learn to not make the mistakes we did. Listen, be partners, yeah.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Definitely an interesting challenge looking forwards, but hopefully there'll be lots of solutions and policy work going into it to see some progress in the next 5 years. So that's all the questions that we had for today. Thank you so much for giving insights into policy and the policy-making process, especially from a more international perspective. It's been really interesting to learn a bit more about that and development challenges compared to emerging economies. It's been really interesting. So thank you so much, Lesley, for your time today.
Thank you for the chance to speak. I've thoroughly enjoyed this.
Thanks for watching. To learn more about Society for the Environment's role in policy, please visit our Knowledge Hub for the latest policy resources and submissions.